I'm going to be talking about Oramics today, which is the lifelong project of the late electronic pioneer Daphne Oram. While it took on many forms over the several decades that she worked on it, the main idea behind Oramics was that it would allow musicians to compose electronic music through graphical notation. And by that I mean that the composer would be able to draw waveforms, pitches, and amplitude, all sorts of musical parameters directly onto film and have that be interpreted and played back by oscillators. And it was really one of the first systems that was able to interpret visual and graphic elements and convert that into music. It was really ahead of its time, since it was probably the first musical interface that bridged the gap between visual language and sonic language, and it was an important precursor to a lot of what contemporary music software is like today. Nowadays, things like drawing waveforms and wavetables for virtual synthesizers, drawing envelopes and automations, and visually notating music with MIDI, these are all things that can be done at the touch of a button, but at the time, that was something that, and we're talking about the early 60s, this was something that didn't exist yet. These were ideas that were existing inside of Daphne Oram's head, and she wanted to create that. Well, it all had to be invented first. And ultimately, because of this, there's kind of this tragedy to Oramics, which is that Oram was reaching for ideas that were a little bit too far ahead of what the technology of the time had to offer. And as a result, it never fully came to fruition. It was kind of always in a state of being a prototype. But sadly, because of this, Oramics was a huge source of frustration for Daphne Oram, because the mechanical elements just couldn't keep up with it. And just to quickly go back, we can't really talk about Oramics without talking about Daphne Oram. She's an electronic composer who was born in England in 1925. When she was 17, she turned down an acceptance into the Royal College of Music and instead took a job doing sound engineering at the BBC, which is where she would cut her teeth on music technology, start experimenting with new sounds, and she was tasked with creating sound effects for radio shows and would often spend hours at night manipulating tape recordings to create completely new sounds, and would dabble in what would eventually become known as musique concrète. And she also composed while doing this. Funny enough, in the 40s, she wrote a score that was some people considered to be the first to combine acoustic orchestration and electronic manipulation. And as was a common theme with her job at the BBC, they actually rejected it. And it existed as a score for years, and was only played for the first time in 2016. So I'm actually going to play a short snippet of that, just to get an idea of what her music sounds like. She was also one of the first composers to bring electronics into film scoring, and the most prominent example of that is her score for The Innocents, which is a supernatural thriller that was adapted from The Turn of the Screw, the Henry James novella. I think nowadays you watch just about any horror movie, and there are electronics everywhere, and there are all sorts of sounds that don't exist in nature, and here's a short segment of that score. She contributed electronic sounds to a number of films in the 1960s, among them actually the first James Bond movie, Dr. No. And for that one, and for a lot of the movies she did, she didn't receive any credit for it. And that was the case with a lot of sound design work she did. This is actually a very common theme in her early career and something that happened a lot while she worked at the BBC, which is one of the reasons she left it in 1959, which is when she received a grant to form Oramics Studios. As I mentioned before, the original Oramics was an electronic musical interface that she worked on during those years. The core of Oramics was that it held 4 reels of clear 35mm film, motion picture film, and each one controlled a specific musical parameter like pitch or dynamics. And then the musician would literally draw music onto the reels. So you could write an entire graphical score, which would then be fed through the machine, which had a number of optical scanners, and interpret that and play it back by oscillators. You could also draw custom waveforms onto glass slides, which gave a lot of control over the sorts of timbres. And it's funny because that's the sort of thing that you can do very easily now in a lot of virtual synthesizers. But back then, you'd be limited to whatever waveform an oscillator could create. We don't have any video demonstrations of the original device, which is actually, it still exists, and it's held in a museum. But a recreation of it was made just a few years ago as part of some guy's PhD thesis. And here's a quick video of that to illustrate what it did and how it worked.
So the first thing I'm going to do is specify an octave, so I'm going to go for the third octave. Then we need to specify a note, which is this top parameter here, so let's go somewhere quite high. Then we need to also specify a volume, and then we'll have a steep drop off to nothing there. Then I'll do, as that goes up, I'll do another volume curve on this other waveform, and again a steep drop. And then this parameter here is going to be reverberation, so I'm just going to bring in a bit towards the end here. I can add a bit of pitch wobble into that, some vibrato, so let's draw that coming up and down here, and let's give that a bit more reverberation on the end. And this is also where we change the waveforms, so we can change those there.
So that was the mini Oramics, which is the replica of it. That works a bit more reliably because it's made contemporarily and with more reliable parts. The original and the Oramics machine never went into commercial production because it was kind of always this evolving prototype because of a lot of the limitations of the technology and the mechanics of the time. It was a very clunky machine, and it was prone to a lot of mechanical error because it required all the film reels as well as the corresponding multi-track tape recorder, which everything would go out to all work in tandem. And keeping these things in sync is incredibly hard. I mean, any film projectionist can tell you, just even keeping 2 reels of a movie together, it's a full-time job. And as a result, we have very little music that was created with Oramics. One of those pieces is Orm's piece "Birds of Parallax," and it's one of very few pieces, recorded pieces of music that used it. It's not entirely made by Oramics, but it does use it prominently in its opening, and here is that. Oramics ended up assuming a number of different forms over several decades as the technology improved, and in the 1980s, Orem actually began working on a software version. It would have been one of the first DAWs if she hadn't run out of funding for it, but it just goes to show you sort of how this machine really was the precursor to a lot of what we take for granted in contemporary electronic music, and not even just electronic music, but electronically recorded and manipulated music. While the device itself wasn't exactly a success, it's an interesting and really important piece of electronic music history. Because despite its flaws, the ideas that Orem was pioneering would eventually manifest themselves in, as I mentioned before, in DAWs and in a MIDI notation. You only have to look at the reels where the musician is drawing on notes. It almost looks like MIDI. And even outside of Oramics, Daphne Orem had enough impact on the development of electronic music that her fully realized works are enough for a whole class. But particularly with Oramics, she was really one of the first people to try and close the gap between that visual and musical expression, and at the same time break away from a lot of the limitations of conventional Western notation, and move towards something that was much more intuitive and hands-on. Um, and it's a lot like how music is made today. So even though it didn't entirely pan out, it really broke ground in a lot of ways.